Tobias Feakin, welcome. So which Russian military units are you blaming for these attacks, and what evidence have you got to prove it?
Sure. So, as you rightly say, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have made this attribution today in partnership with our allies, with the UK specifically. We have made this attribution to the Russian military intelligence agency, specifically the foreign wing, the foreign intelligence wing of that agency, the GRU. And we, whilst not revealing all of our evidence for very obvious reasons, it's very sensitive data that we use to make this attribution, to be able to make an attribution with such certainty as to which specific part of the Russian intelligence apparatus was responsible. Everyone can take confidence that our degree of certainty is incredibly high here, and that the evidence package that we have is very certain, because we don't often make attributions quite so specifically in a case like this.
The Russians will no doubt say this is rubbish. What more can you give us to give us confidence that what you're saying is accurate?
Sure. So I can certainly talk you through a process that we would go through so you can understand how a government would think about making an attribution like this. Obviously, we draw on intelligence and information from our partners and allies that we've been provided, which obviously comes with a high degree of certainty. We then look at using, as you rightly pointed out, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and our various other agencies who deal with delivering cybersecurity for Australia, look at the evidence that we have as to what's going on here in Australia as well. Then we take into account a whole range of other factors. So we look at the technical evidence, we look at, if you like, the legal case that goes alongside that, the other surrounding factors, what's going on geopolitically. And what we do know geopolitically is that Russia is stretching the boundaries of the international rules-based order, be it in its annexation of Crimea, be it in its taking down of MH17. You know, these kinds of instances, and the Salisbury Plain incident, the chemical weapons issues there, when you add that into its entirety, it shows a pattern of behaviour. Taking all of that evidence into consideration, it's quite a lengthy process. That's how we make our evaluation, and then will advise that the attribution is sound. And in this case, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister making this attribution is further evidence of the certainty that we have in who is responsible for this array of instances, which go back quite some time. And it's important that we do at times package pieces of evidence like this together in order that you see a pattern of behaviour evolving over time, which can be attributed to a specific country and also an agency.
And so have you pinpointed a specific geographic location within Russia or somewhere where these attacks originated? If we had, unfortunately, I wouldn't be talking about that on TV. I think you'll understand that, you know, when we're talking about intelligence matters, there's a huge degree of sensitivity around this. But it was the case, Tobias Feakin, when there was suggestions that China was responsible for certain instances, that it became public knowledge that there was a particular building in China that people pinpointed that some of these attacks were coming from.
Sure. Interestingly, that package that you're talking about was something which was attributed by Mandiant, which is a private sector company. So absolutely, they can go into a level of detail that as a government we couldn't actually do. So I understand you know, the level of detail that particular case went into, but that was through a private sector company which decided to expose a level of behaviour. In this case, it's states who are exposing behaviour, a group of allies and partners, and it's a different case in a government sense, the degree of information that we can put out. What you can be assured of is that, you know, what we're trying to do as states is expose patterns of behaviour, not just to Russia, even though we now have attributed a range of actions to them. We recently attributed mass automated router scanning to Russia. We also attributed the NotPetya malware attacks to Russia as well, which took down Ukrainian infrastructure, also took down a whole range of different private sector companies' networks, and caused billions of dollars worth of damage. We've also attributed the WannaCry incident to North Korea. So what we're showing is that our ability to attribute is getting much, much better, and we can pinpoint who is responsible in order that we can change the risk calculus of those states that think that they can get away with this without being noted. Because in the past that might have been the case, but internationally we're getting better at this, and if you like, this is one step, exposing the behaviour, and we are as a nation looking at what other kinds of responses we have, what other levers of government do we have in order that we can respond to these instances beyond the actual attribution, and then also how can you take those responses and ensure that they plug and play with all the other partners that we work with in the international community. And it's a very live discussion amongst a large group of states in terms of what kinds of other pressures can we bring to bear.
Are you in a position to say if this was Russian agents acting within the borders of Russia, or if you believe that some elements of this attack happened outside with Russian agents outside Russian borders?
Sure, we're not going into that level of detail. What we're saying is that as a grouping of behaviour, as in the case of the Democratic National Congress, the theft of very sensitive emails and data, and then the subsequent targeted dropping of that into very public online spaces, the fact that there is the clear hacking of the World Doping Authority's databases, and then again the targeted dropping of that information in the international setting during a very sensitive time for Russia when it was undergoing a lot of serious investigation from WADA for doping offences from its athletes, the fact that it is willing to take down critical national infrastructure in the Ukraine through the use of offensive malware, which in the international setting we have agreed through the UN group of government experts, through multilateral agreements which Russia has been part of, that critical national infrastructure is out of bounds during peacetime. What we're saying is that collectively when you take all of these actions, they are breaking, they're looking to challenge the international rules-based order, and that is something that we as Australia, as a responsible state actor in cyberspace, and also with our partners, we're not willing to accept that, and we think it's worthy of exposure, attribution, and follow-up.
So were Australians hacked, affected, or had their privacy compromised by these attacks?
Sure. So we made an assessment, and we felt that the impact on Australia in that regard was minimal. But in this case, we felt it was because of the severity of the incidents that were presented to us and the evidence package we had. It's important that we stand together with partners when trying to expose these kinds of behaviour. It won't be that every single cyber incident will be taking place on Australian shores, but it's important that we do support allies in the same way that we do in a whole array of different arenas when we're responding to issues in the physical world. So the principles are very similar, and in this case that's what we're trying to demonstrate.
In recent years there's been a lot of talk about attacks on democratic elections. Is there any evidence that state-based actors have targeted Australia's democracy?
We don't have evidence of that, but what in terms of the election interference issue, we appreciate that President Trump has agreed with his intelligence agency's assessment that it was Russia who's responsible. So we are in lockstep with our partners again in that regard, and there have been previous statements made around in 2017 around that particular issue. So the DNC issue, the Democratic National Congress issue, is in and around that, but the very concrete evidence we have there we feel was worthy of public exposure and again attribution, and the more that we can expose these patterns of behaviour, we feel the less likely we're to see if you like the breaking of the rules in the way that we are right now.
Yeah, and so is there, I think in the last couple of weeks, President Trump has suggested, I think it's that the Chinese, he's concerned that the Chinese will want to target the coming midterm elections. Are you in the loop on any evidence around that, or are you aware of any evidence that the Chinese or any other state actor is planning to disrupt these midterm elections?
I couldn't comment on another state's intelligence data in the sense of things which are ongoing and very sensitive right now. So that's not a question I can address.
Okay.
Definitely here to talk about Russia and an attribution from our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister.
Yeah, and now that you have the evidence, what offensive and defensive actions has Australia taken to prevent the Russians doing it again?
Sure. So I think rather than say offensive actions, I'd talk about proactive actions. Essentially, from a defensive point of view, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, headed by Alistair McGibbon, is working incredibly hard to try and uplift our cyber defences. And, that's one part of this. The harder target we are to be pinpointed by another state or any other actor for that matter, the better, because that raises the cost in terms of their ability to come after us. So that's one aspect of it. Secondly, the kind of proactive measures, that's something we're assessing at the moment inside government. What are all the different levers that we have across government that we could bring to bear? It might be that it's a law enforcement response, a diplomatic response, and a whole array of other activities that we as a government can bring to bear. And as I said earlier, how do you then multiply those by joining with other international partners who are also willing to take action around these kinds of activities? In this case, we will be making diplomatic representations to the Russians in order that we get an official response back from them in terms of this attribution.
And now that Russia has been officially named, is it likely that any of these countries that are naming Russia will seek further penalties against Russia, like diplomatic expulsions?
Well, that's a matter for them to decide. But as I say, it's certainly part of our current discussion with international partners and allies about the next steps. As you implied, that could potentially be one of them around these kinds of instances, and has been when we look back at instances like the Salisbury plane incident, where there were diplomatic expulsions. In this case, we're making diplomatic representations, but we would never put anything off the table in the future.
So what other elements might that involve apart from diplomatic expulsions?
Sure. Well, in this case, I'm not going to talk about them in reference to this case, but as I mentioned, in terms of assessing what other levers you have at your disposal, you could exemplify the way that the US has approached this at times. It's looked at indicting individuals, highlighting specific individuals who they felt have been responsible for other particular instances, and in that case, apply pressure through legal approaches. Law enforcement approaches can also be used. Also, there could be the potential for some kind of economic sanctions. Again, I'm talking about these in separation from this particular incident because we're still assessing what you have at your disposal. But all of these levers of government are there and available should we require.
So can you say whether you have identified particular individuals within the Russian intelligence service that have been responsible for these hacks?
No, not in this case. We are identifying the agency, the GRU, as responsible for this set of instances.
Now, it's unusual for Australia to name and shame a cyber attacker. Now that you have, would the government undertake to call out China or any other nation which is also found to have perpetrated attacks?
So we have attributed a whole range of different activities before, from supporting the US in the case of attributing the Sony hack to North Korea. Last December, we attributed the WannaCry ransomware attack to North Korea as well. I think many viewers would remember that, where it took down National Health Service systems in the UK and affected hundreds of countries' computer networks. Also, we attributed the NotPetya malware incident, which took down infrastructure in Ukraine, and I mentioned it earlier in our interview. We attributed that to Russia as well. So we do have a pattern here of attributing different activities. But I would say, and I'm not going to comment on other countries, we take everything on a case-by-case scenario, because there are different approaches depending on the kind of incident you're dealing with and who might be responsible.
Okay, Tobias Fegan, thanks so much for talking to us this morning from Canberra.
It's a pleasure, thank you.